Excuse me. So most often than not, you realize that when you are involved in a debate that most people don't have a good reason as to why they take a particular stance on an issue, but they take that stance nevertheless. And so this is pretty common in America. It is also very common all over the world. And I'm going to give you a specific example of an ongoing debate that's happening in Kenya. And it's going to show you what I'm talking about. So there is this debate going on because there were two lions that were captured on a photo, and the two lions were mating, and they are both male. And so the issue of homosexuality came up, and I was following the discussion and the trend, and lots of people were arguing that homosexuality is an African. Okay, let me repeat that. They were arguing that homosexuality is not African. And so the problem with that kind of a stance, and I mean, it can take many shapes. It doesn't have to be something is not African. It can be somebody arguing that that argument is religious. You know, an argument cannot be religious or not. Okay, just like an idea cannot be African or not. The idea has to be invalid or valid. Okay, an idea has to be destructive or beneficial. And so you have to provide evidence to justify your position on an issue. Okay, now let's jump back into this issue of homosexuality being an African. So let's say somebody takes that stance. So the question becomes, what is African? Okay, now one African might argue that homosexuality is an African, and then another African on the other side say it is African. So who is right? There's no way to verify which one is right, because they're arguing on something that's not objectively verifiable. And so that is very difficult to. On the other hand, you might actually have certain groups in Africa that actually practice homosexuality. So would you say those groups are not African? You cannot argue that either. And so you have to have valid reasons that are objective, showing why your stance is the right stance on an issue. You have to provide reasons why. So, for example, on this issue of homosexuality, you can provide evidence showing that homosexuality goes against nature. You can show that physically, male and female are compatible. And in the compatibility, they're able even to reproduce, which is required to further a society. And a society cannot sustain itself if it's not reproducing. You can point to the fact that homosexuality produces a lot of sexually transmitted diseases. There's evidence of that. You can show that homosexuality is directly linked to poor mental health. Suicide rates among homosexuals is extremely high. You can provide such evidence. You can show that homosexuality takes away from children by taking either their mom or their dad, because two men cannot have a child. So if there is a child involved, they have to be taken away from their mother. And so you have to provide objective evidence that shows that your point or your stance is a correct stance based on valid points. And so that changes the whole debate. And so now the issue is not whether homosexuality is African or not, it's whether homosexuality is beneficial or destructive, whether it's natural or unnatural, and so you can produce evidence to show that. And so that also changes the angle of the discussion. And so the idea that something is African or not goes away completely, so that now homosexuality is not judged on the context, whether it's Africa or Europe or whatever. It is just judged by the outcomes and observable outcomes. And in that case, therefore, the product homosexuality everywhere would be the same. So the same argument would be valid whether you are in America, whether you live in China, whether you live in Korea, whether you live in Indonesia. It doesn't matter. Homosexuality would be looked up and considered under those same points. Whether it's destructive in Africa, it is destructive everywhere else. And so that changes the whole narrative. It changes the whole argument. And so you don't have to justify something being African or not, which you cannot. And so, again, going back to my initial point, arguments cannot be African or not. Arguments can be valid or invalid. Arguments can be beneficial or destructive or non-beneficial. Ideas can be right or wrong, but you have to provide justification. You have to show why you're taking a particular stance on an issue, and you have to provide objective evidence, not based on your own feeling or thinking, but something that applies to everybody else because it is objectively verifiable. I hope that is helpful. Next time you're arguing with somebody, think about through an issue. Think about the counter argument. Don't take a stance whereby if somebody else took the opposite stance, there was no way to show who is right or wrong. Take a stance, think about the issue. There's a lot of evidence on any issue that you can think of, and find a reason why you think what you think. I hope that's helpful.